I could still see the look on his face when I handed my daughter the deed. The colour drained from him instantly. His wine glass froze halfway to his mouth, and nobody at the table said anything. The silence was perfect, absolute. My son-in-law David had choreographed this moment perfectly, waiting for Thanksgiving dinner with the whole family gathered his moment to say what he'd been thinking all along. I'd let him have it. I'd sat there and listened while he mocked my house, while he called it a dump, while he explained what he'd do with it once I was gone. I'd watched my daughter's face go tight, watched my sister exchange a look with her husband, and I'd smiled. A real smile. The kind that comes from knowing something nobody else knew yet. That's when I pulled out the folder with the cream-coloured stock. I slid it towards Sarah. "I thought it was time to make some things official," I said quietly. She looked at it uncertainly. "Open it." As her eyes scanned the pages, her face transformed. Confusion, shock, then something that looked like vindication mixed with grief. "The deed," she whispered. "It's in my name." "Transferred this morning," I confirmed. "The house is yours." That's when David made his sound, not a word, a choking noise as the wine went down wrong. He sputtered, his face turning red. Nobody moved to help him. My sister actually turned away, either to avoid watching or to hide a smile. That moment wasn't the beginning. It was the ending of something that had been building for a very long time. To understand how we got there, you have to go back. Not too far. Just far enough to see the cracks forming. Just far enough to understand the weight stacking on my shoulders, the disappointments, the slow realization that the life I'd built was being dismantled by someone I'd trusted. Let me take you back about 8 months before that Thanksgiving dinner. It was March. Spring hadn't quite arrived yet, and the house was still settling into the cold in that way old houses do. The place has been in my family for 32 years. Sarah's mother Ellen and I bought it when it was just a skeleton of a thing, gutted and broken. The kind of project that most people would have walked away from. Ellen had fallen in love with it on first sight, standing in the empty living room with holes in the walls and water damage creeping across the ceiling. Most people would have run. Ellen didn't run. She never did. She saw something in it. She always did. She could see potential where everyone else saw disaster. We poured ourselves into that house. Every weekend for the first 5 years was spent fixing something, building something, restoring something. Saturday mornings I'd wake up and we'd make a list. There was always a list. Ellen planted the gardens and they were stunning. Roses and hydrangeas, peonies that bloomed in perfect pink clusters. I rebuilt the foundation, replaced the roof, rewired the electrical system myself with help from my brother-in-law. It took months of my vacation time, but we got it done. Sarah grew up running through those rooms, playing in that backyard, making memories between the walls that we'd saved from collapse. I remember her at 6 years old helping me paint the living room. She got more paint on herself than on the walls, but she was so proud of it. She'd stand in the doorway and tell people, "My daddy and I painted this room," like she'd single-handedly saved the house, in a way she had. That kind of work, that kind of commitment, it bonds people to a place. It makes it more than just a structure. It makes it alive. When Ellen passed away 9 years ago, the house became even more important to me. She died on a Tuesday in late spring and the world felt wrong. It held her everywhere. In the garden she'd designed. In the kitchen where she'd taught Sarah to cook. In the bedroom where we'd built our life. I'd wake up and forget she was gone. That moment lasting maybe 10 seconds before reality crashed back. I'd think about Ellen, about how fiercely she'd loved this place. The least I could do was keep it standing, protect it. Sarah married David 5 years after Ellen died. I won't pretend I was thrilled about it. David had charm, the kind that works well on first meetings and in social situations, where people don't know you well enough to see through it. He was handsome in a polished way, the kind of man who knew how to work a room. He was a real estate developer, or at least that's what he called himself. What he actually did was flip houses. He'd buy properties, make cosmetic improvements, and sell them for quick profits. Sometimes the improvements were barely improvements at all, fresh paint, new hardware on the cabinets, maybe some updated lighting fixtures. Just enough to make a place look newer than it was. There was nothing wrong with that, nothing inherently dishonest about it. But it meant he saw houses differently than Ellen and I did. He saw them as commodities, as numbers on a spreadsheet, as potential revenue streams. He did not see them as homes. He did not see them as places where lives happened. where memories accumulated like dust, where the cracks in the plaster told stories. The first few years were fine. David was cordial enough at holidays, helpful with small projects, present at family functions. But over time, something shifted. It started small. A comment here, an observation there. "This kitchen really is outdated," he said during Easter dinner. "The hardwood under this carpet is probably worth recovering." Just casual observations like he was appraising the property, cataloguing its flaws. Like a realtor preparing a listing breakdown, Sarah noticed. She'd catch him doing it and give me an apologetic look. During one visit, he was photographing Ellen's gardens in the backyard. Not pictures of the flowers themselves, but the layout, the spacing, the dimensions. Sarah found me afterward and shook her head. "He's calculating how much space we could gain by removing the beds," she said quietly. Very casually mentioned it, but I know what he was thinking. I never said anything to him about it. I was her father, but she was a grown woman. She'd chosen this man. My job was to be there for her. Things got worse about 18 months before that Thanksgiving dinner. David's business started struggling. The real estate market had cooled significantly. Inventory was tight. His margins were shrinking. He'd mentioned it casually, in conversation, the way people do when they're looking for sympathy or for someone to tell them everything will be fine. I'd see it coming. The way he'd shift the conversation at family dinners, steering things toward money, toward markets, toward opportunities. He'd talk about deals he'd almost made, properties he'd almost bought, investors he'd almost connected with. There was always an almost. There was never a concrete success. Sarah started to worry. I could see it in the way she'd check her phone during dinner, probably reviewing their bank accounts. She'd call me after they had arguments about money. She'd sit on my porch with a cup of tea and explain his situation, his debts, his overextended investments, how he'd borrowed against properties, how he'd counted on sales that never came through, how the whole thing was starting to feel fragile. She'd ask if I could help him, if I had any connections, if I could maybe co-sign a loan or something, maybe a business partner, maybe somebody who understood real estate development. I told her no, and I could see that hurt her, the way my refusal landed like a rejection of him, which it was. But not because I didn't have the means to help. I did. I've been careful with money my whole life, and retirement had been good to me. I had options. But David had never asked me directly. He'd never been honest about his situation, never sat down and said, "I'm in trouble. I need help. Here's the truth." And more than that, I didn't trust him with money. Not after watching him spend his way into this hole in the first place. Not after watching him make decisions that any competent businessman should have seen coming. I didn't want my retirement to go toward bailing him out of mistakes that were entirely his own fault. That was when David's attitude toward the house changed. It shifted. Subtly at first, then less subtly. He started making more pointed comments. The house had potential, he'd say. Real potential. If it was updated, if it was really developed, it could be worth a lot more. He had ideas, he said. He could help us renovate. He had connections with contractors. He knew people who could get things done efficiently. He could turn it into something really special, really valuable. These conversations always happened in that specific way, with that specific tone that made it clear the value he was talking about was financial value. It wasn't about making it beautiful. It wasn't about honouring Ellen's memory or Sarah's childhood home. It was about market value. Return on investment. Then came the harder questions, the ones that made my skin crawl. Had I thought about selling? Had I considered downsizing to something smaller, more manageable, something more appropriate for a man my age living alone? Had I thought about what would happen to the house when I was gone? How much estate tax Sarah would owe? How burdened she might feel trying to maintain an old property? The implications were clear. The house was a liability to me, he was suggesting. But it could be an asset if it was handled properly, if it was developed properly, if I was smart about it. I remember the first time he asked me directly if I'd considered leaving the house to him and Sarah. We were in the kitchen, and I was making coffee. Sarah was in the other room. It was a Sunday morning, and he'd come over to look at a water stain on the ceiling. That was his excuse anyway. The stain was minor, probably just from an old roof leak, nothing serious, but he'd come inside and followed me into the kitchen instead of going upstairs to examine it. He was quiet for a moment, and I could sense what was coming. Then he asked. It was such a casual question, dropped into the conversation so smoothly, it took me a moment to realise what he'd actually asked. He said, "Have you thought about the logistics of transferring this place to Sarah? I mean, estate planning is complicated and you want to do right by her, don't you?" We've been talking about how we could make this place really work for us, for our future together. It would be so much easier if you just transferred it now. Avoid the estate taxes. Let us start working on it. I told him I hadn't decided yet. I was still relatively healthy. I wasn't making decisions about my will. I wasn't making decisions about transferring property not to anyone. Not now. That seemed to agitate him. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened. He left the room quickly, but he let it go for a while. I started paying more attention. I started noticing things. The way his eyes would move through the rooms, calculating. The way he'd take photos of the house and then spend time on his phone, probably pricing comparable properties in the neighbourhood. The way he'd talk about renovation costs and market values when he thought I wasn't listening. He wasn't trying to hide it anymore. He was becoming more open about his interest, more transparent about what he saw when he looked at my home. Sarah felt it too. She could see her husband circling, assessing, planning. She'd make excuses when he suggested spending too much time at the house. She'd redirect conversations when he started talking about what needed to be fixed or updated. But she was stuck in an impossible position. He was her husband. He was struggling financially, and he was clearly putting pressure on her to help him get access to what he saw as a solution to his problems. It came to a head about 6 weeks before Thanksgiving. David had asked me directly again, this time about updating my will. He'd come to the house on a Saturday afternoon, ostensibly to help with some repairs to the kitchen cabinet doors that had been sticking. But when Sarah was in the other room getting ready to go to yoga with a friend, he pulled me aside and asked me point blank if I'd considered naming Sarah as the primary beneficiary of the house, with the understanding that he and Sarah would work together to maximize the property's potential. He used that phrase specifically. I remember it because it sounded so rehearsed, like he'd been practicing it, like he'd prepared for this moment, with the understanding, he said, that together we could really do something with this property. Maybe a renovation, maybe add some square footage. There's serious equity here, and it could be so much more than it is. I told him that was between me and Sarah, and that my will was my business. I told him I didn't appreciate him asking about my estate planning. He didn't like that answer. I could see the frustration flash across his face. He left early that day, making some excuse about needing to check on another property. And when I hugged Sarah goodbye, I felt her hold on a little longer than usual, like she was apologising for having married him, like she was sorry for bringing someone into my life who saw my home as a financial opportunity to be exploited. The discovery didn't come suddenly. It was more like a slow accumulation of small things that finally added up to a complete picture. I'd started paying closer attention to his financial situation because I was worried about Sarah. I was worried about what would happen to her if he continued spiralling. A few weeks before Thanksgiving, she mentioned in passing that they'd been served with foreclosure papers on a rental property he owned. He'd stopped paying the mortgage months ago. He was trying to work out a deal with the bank, but it was looking bad. He'd been avoiding opening the letters. She found them in his desk drawer, unopened, and that's when she knew how serious things had gotten. Then she mentioned his credit card debt, multiple cards, all maxed out. She didn't even know the total. When I asked her how much total debt they were dealing with, she couldn't even look me in the eye. It was more than I'd expected, more than I thought possible. She was talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. She was talking about possibly losing their own house, their actual home, where they lived together, where she'd built her life with him. She said his business had been losing money for months. He'd been taking out personal loans to cover business expenses. Some of those loans were predatory. The interest rates were astronomical. She was terrified about what would happen. I did something I'm not particularly proud of, but I did it anyway. I needed to understand the full scope of what was happening. I hired an investigator, a private detective I'd used before for background checks on contractors. I needed him to look into David's financial situation comprehensively. He was my daughter's husband, and I wanted to understand how deep this hole went. I wanted to know if there was something I could do to help her, if this was salvageable, if this was just a rough patch, or if this was a complete collapse. The report came back thick and detailed. It was worse than Sarah had said. Much worse. David was drowning. Business debts to suppliers, personal debts to banks and credit card companies, back taxes owed to the government from years of poor accounting, judgments against him from creditors he'd defrauded through failed business deals. His business wasn't struggling. It was dead. It had been dead for over a year, and he'd been operating on fumes and credit lines at this point. Overdrafts and cash advances, Credit cards used to pay other credit cards. It was a spiral, a vicious downward spiral. And what struck me most about the report was the timeline. Every single one of those conversations I'd witnessed, every single one of those questions about my house, about my will, about downsizing and renovating, they'd started escalating right around the time his business started collapsing. They were all connected. They were all about one thing. He needed money. Badly. And he'd decided that my house was his way out. He'd decided that if he could position himself to control my estate, if he could get his name on my deed, if he could somehow make himself the beneficiary of my will, he could solve all his problems in one stroke. He could take my house, renovate it, flip it for a massive profit, and use that money to pay off his debts. I was his solution. My home was his solution. The house that Ellen and I had built from rubble. The house where Sarah had grown up. It was just numbers on a spreadsheet to him. That's when I understood what was happening. That's when the anger started to set in. Not the hot, immediate kind of anger. The cold kind. The patient kind. The kind that comes with planning. The kind that makes you think clearly instead of acting rashly. I'd been protecting this house from falling apart my entire adult life. I'd been protecting it for Ellen, protecting it for Sarah, protecting it for the memories we'd built inside those walls. And now I had someone in my family who saw it as nothing more than a solution to his own irresponsibility, someone who was actively trying to position himself to take it from me. Someone who would probably tear it down and sell the land if he got the chance. He wouldn't maintain Ellen's gardens. He wouldn't preserve the stories. He'd strip it for value and move on to the next mark. That's what men like David do. I called my lawyer the next day. His name is Richard, and we'd been working together for 15 years. We scheduled a time to meet in his office downtown. Away from the house, away from Sarah, away from David, I needed privacy for this conversation. I needed to think clearly without the distraction of familiar surroundings. I sat across from him in his conference room and explained the situation. I told him everything. The comments David had made, the direct questions about my will and my estate, the pressure he'd applied, the financial investigation, all of it. His face didn't change much as I talked, but I could see him processing, understanding exactly what was happening here. This wasn't just a son-in-law being rude. This was predatory behavior. This was financial exploitation of a family member. When I finished, Richard leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "He's building a case for undue influence if you're not careful." We talked about options. I could do nothing and let things play out. I could talk to David directly and ask him to stop. I could talk to Sarah and explain my concerns, or I could take action. And then I said what I'd been thinking about since I first found out about those foreclosure papers. I wanted to transfer the house to Sarah. Not to David, not to both of them, just Sarah. And I wanted to do it in a way that made it clear the house was hers and hers alone, that David had no claim to it, no way to use it as collateral, no path to ownership. Richard nodded and pulled out a legal pad. He explained how it would work. We'd transfer the title in a way that protected Sarah's interest. We could set it up so that even if Sarah and David divorced, the house would remain hers. We could document the transfer clearly so there would be no confusion, no legal ambiguity. But then he warned me. He warned me about potential family conflict, about David's possible reaction, about how this might create tension in Sarah's marriage. He asked if I'd thought about whether this was worth damaging my relationship with my daughter. I told him I had thought about it, and I told him I didn't care. I'd watched my daughter marry someone I'd come to despise. I'd watched him circle my family's home like a vulture. I'd watched him manipulate and probe and scheme, and I was done with it. If Sarah didn't understand why I was doing this, then she'd have to come to understand it eventually. Because the alternative was letting a predator strip my family of the only substantial thing we had. The alternative was letting him win. But I didn't do it quietly. That was the decision that came later, the one that I'm not sure was wise, but that I didn't regret for a second. That decision came while I was sitting at home that night, alone in the house that had been my sanctuary for so long. I'd meant to just transfer the house quietly, schedule the paperwork, go to the lawyer's office, have it transferred. Done. Over with. Clean and simple. But then I thought about David at Thanksgiving. I thought about what he'd probably say, how he'd probably act, how he'd probably treat Sarah once he found out his plan had failed. I thought about him finding the documentation, seeing the transferred title, realizing that his scheme had been thwarted. and I realized I wanted him to know that I knew. I wanted him to feel the way I'd felt watching him circle my home like a predator. I wanted him to experience a moment of complete and utter humiliation in front of witnesses, so that he'd understand that he'd miscalculated, that he'd overestimated my desperation to keep family peace and underestimated my willingness to protect what was mine. So I decided to do it publicly at Thanksgiving, in front of the family. I decided to give him an audience for his humiliation, just like he'd wanted to humiliate me with his comments about the house being a dump. I'd let him dig his own grave. I'd let him make his statement, and then I'd bury him with his own words. He gave me the opening I needed about 20 minutes after we'd sat down to dinner. We were passing around the dishes, and David started talking about the house, about how it really was a great property if you thought about it from an investment perspective. He'd had some people out to look at it, he said, contractors and developers, and they'd all agreed it had solid bones. It just needed updating modern kitchen, new flooring, fresh paint, maybe some expansion. It could be worth a lot more than what it was worth now, he said. And then he looked right at me and smiled that smile of his, the one that doesn't reach his eyes. You know, when you're not around anymore, he said, we're definitely going to renovate this place, really make it something special. The room went quiet. Sarah's eyes went wide. My sister looked like she'd been hit. David was looking so pleased with himself, so confident in his ownership of the moment he thought he'd made his move. He thought he'd finally said the quiet part out loud, and now everyone knew what he wanted. I stood up slowly, I looked right at him and I smiled, and then I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder. The moment I pulled out that folder, I knew everything was about to change. I could see it in the way David's face shifted, the way his hand froze halfway to his wine glass, the way the room seemed to hold its breath. Nobody knew what I was holding yet, but they all understood that something significant was happening, that something I'd been planning, something I'd kept secret, was about to be revealed. The weight of that folder in my hands felt appropriate for what it contained. It was heavier than any piece of paper should be. It represented a decision I'd made deliberately, carefully, with full knowledge of what it meant and what it would cost. A decision that had kept me up at night for weeks. A decision that felt both right and terrifying. The lawyer's office had felt sterile and distant when I sat down with Richard that second time, after I'd made my final decision. He'd laid out the documents, and we'd gone through them, line by line, the transfer of deed papers, all properly notarized and witnessed. The language was clear and unambiguous. The house would be transferred to Sarah solely and exclusively, with no claim available to her spouse, no right of survivorship to anyone else. It was airtight. It was what I wanted. Richard had arranged for independent witnesses, people with no connection to me or my family, so there could be no argument later about the validity of the transfer, no claim of undue influence or fraud. This was going to be documented to death. But before we finalized it, Richard had asked me one more time if I was certain. He'd looked at me over his reading glasses and said, "This will end his scheme. But it might also put you in a difficult position with your daughter. If she feels like you've made decisions about her future without consulting her, you should know that going in." He'd been cautious, careful to make sure I understood the emotional fallout that might come from this decision. He'd seen divorce cases, family disputes, estrangement. He'd seen what happened when parents made unilateral decisions about property without consulting their adult children. I'd thought about that, I'd thought about it a lot. Sarah would understand eventually. She'd have to, because the alternative was letting someone she'd married take everything that had been in our family for 32 years. The alternative was allowing him to strip away the legacy that Ellen had built, that my daughter had grown up in. That housed her most important memories. "I'm certain," I told Richard. "I need to protect her, even if she doesn't understand why right now." He'd nodded and started the process immediately. He'd had the deed pulled, reviewed the title, confirmed there were no liens or complications. He'd drawn up the transfer documents in language that left no room for misinterpretation. Sarah's name, the house, fully and solely her property. He'd scheduled the notarization and had it completed within 48 hours. I'd signed the documents feeling like I was signing something far more significant than legal paperwork. I was signing away the house Ellen and I had built, but I was signing it into the hands of the person I trusted most, my daughter, the woman who understood what that house meant, who'd grown up inside its walls, who'd never see it as merely an asset to be exploited. "It's done," Richard had said, handing me the final deed. "Your daughter now owns the property free and clear. If you want to tell her, If you want to let her find out some other way, that's your decision. But legally this is completed. He can't touch it. He can't inherit it if something happens to you. He can't claim any interest in it whatsoever. Even if they divorce, even if they fight over the division of assets, this house remains hers. I'd held that deed for a long moment, feeling the weight of what I'd just done. I'd taken an action that was entirely within my rights, but it would fundamentally alter my family's relationships. I'd essentially declared war on David without his knowledge. I'd protected my daughter in a way that would make her understand her father would do anything to keep her safe, but it would also make her understand that her marriage was over, that the man she'd trusted had tried to manipulate his way into our family's most valuable possession. Now, sitting at my kitchen table a few days after the transfer had been completed, I'd written Sarah a letter. Not about the transfer, that would come later, but about David, about what I'd discovered, about the investigation and the financial details and the pattern of his questions about my will, and the house I'd written it carefully, making sure I was being factual without being inflammatory, making sure I was presenting evidence rather than accusations. I'd included copies of the financial documents, the foreclosure papers, the collection agency letters. I'd wanted her to understand that this wasn't suspicion or paranoia, this was documented fact. This was the reality of the man she'd married. I'd sealed it in an envelope and put it in my desk drawer, and I'd decided to tea, hollow before Thanksgiving. I'd decided to tell her what I'd done and why, and I knew it would hurt. I knew she'd need time to process it, but I also knew she needed to know what her husband was planning before she made any more decisions about their life together. I'd called her on a Tuesday afternoon. She'd come over to the house straight from work, still in her scrubs from the hospital. Looking exhausted, I'd made tea like we always did, when we had something serious to talk about. She'd sat down at the kitchen table, and I'd handed her the letter. She'd read it without interrupting, her face growing paler with each paragraph. She'd gotten to the financial records and had to set them down for a moment, taking a breath like she'd been punched. When she finished, she'd set everything down slowly, and I could see the internal collapse happening. The realization that the man she'd married wasn't who she'd thought he was, the understanding that his concern for her had been a mask over something much darker, his desperate, calculating need to solve his financial problems by using the people who loved him. Did you really have someone investigate him? She'd asked quietly, her voice small. Yes, I'd said. How much do we owe? She was looking at the numbers like they might change. If she stared at them long enough, they wouldn't. That's between you and the people he owes money to. But Sarah, that's not why I'm telling you this. He said if I was worried about money, I should talk to you. He said you'd help us out, that you owed it to the family. He said that. He said you were old and you wouldn't need the money anyway. He said it was better to let it go to family than to let it sit in the bank. He said you weren't being a good father if you let your daughter's marriage suffer because of financial hardship. The manipulations were elegant. I had to give him that. He'd understood exactly how to pressure Sarah, how to invoke family duty, how to make refusing to help sound like a failure of love. He'd weaponized her conscience against her. Why didn't you tell me sooner? She'd asked, looking up from the documents. Because I needed to understand the full scope of what was happening before I said anything. I needed to be sure this wasn't just a rough patch. I needed to be sure he was actively scheming rather than just struggling. I needed evidence, not just suspicions. She'd left my house that day without saying much more. But I knew she was processing. I knew she was questioning everything she thought she knew about her marriage. That was the part I hated most. I hadn't wanted to be the one to destroy her illusions, but David had done that already. I was just revealing what was already broken. The week before Thanksgiving, she'd called me. She'd been in the car, and I could hear the road sounds in the background, the windshield wipers beating against rain. She'd said, I confronted him, about the financial situation, about talking to my father. Her voice had been steady but hollow. He said you were interfering. He said you were trying to turn me against him. What did you say? I'd asked. I said I needed some time. I told him I'd be staying at your house for a few days. I told him I needed to think about what I wanted to do. What did he do? He tried to convince me to stay. He promised things would get better. He said everything was going to turn around soon. He said he had some big opportunities coming up, some investment deals that were about to close. He said if I'd just trust him a little longer, if I'd just support him, we'd be okay. I'd heard that before, from him. Those investment opportunities that never materialized. Those big deals that never closed. He was desperate and lying, and they both knew it. But she wanted to believe him. That was the cruelest part of being married to someone like David. You wanted to believe them because believing them was easier than facing the reality of what you'd committed to. Did you tell him no? I'd asked. I didn't really answer. I just said I needed time away. He didn't like that. He kept pushing, kept asking when I'd be back, kept trying to convince me that we needed to work on things together. But I told him I was staying with you for a few days and I hung up. Good, I'd said. Come stay. She'd come to the house that night and stayed in her old bedroom, surrounded by the relics of her childhood. Soccer trophies, framed photos, the bookshelf I'd built for her 8th birthday in the morning. I told her about the deed transfer and explained my reasoning. I'd told her the house was hers now, protected, that regardless of what happened with her marriage, she'd always have somewhere safe, somewhere he couldn't touch or use as leverage. She'd cried. Not because she was angry at me, but because she understood what I was doing. I was trying to protect her from the same predatory behaviour that had driven David into financial catastrophe. She put her head down on the table and cried in a way that suggested the weight of everything was finally becoming real. What do I do? She'd asked, looking lost in a way I hadn't seen since childhood. That's up to you, I'd said, but you don't have to decide right now. Just breathe. Process this. The rest will come. The days leading up to Thanksgiving had felt strange. David had called multiple times trying to convince Sarah to come back home. He'd called on Wednesday morning, his voice all concern and contrition. He'd said he understood she was upset, that he deserved it, that he'd been making poor decisions, but he wanted to make it right. He wanted them to work on things together. He'd said he loved her, that everything he'd been doing had ultimately been for their future, that he'd just gotten lost in the stress. And Sarah had listened to it all while sitting in my house, looking increasingly conflicted, increasingly unsure. She'd hung up and looked at me. He sounds so sincere, she'd said. He really does sound like he means it. He means it, I'd said, but meaning it and being capable of change are two different things. And meaning it and being honest about the situation are also two different things. He's not telling you the truth about what he's done or why he's done it. On Thursday, he'd called again using a different approach. He'd been angry, accusing Sarah of abandoning him, of not supporting him in his time of need, of siding with her father. He'd said that wasn't what marriage meant. He'd told her I was poison, that I was controlling her, that I was keeping them apart because I'd never approved of him. And when she'd tried to respond, he'd hung up on her. She'd looked at me with tears in her eyes after that call. Is he right? Am I being manipulated by you? No, I'd said. When someone's manipulation is about to fail, they get desperate. They switch tactics. They try to make the victim doubt their own instincts. They try to isolate the victim from anyone who might offer a different perspective. That's what he's doing. On Friday evening, he'd called again. This time he'd been calm, almost defeated. He'd asked if Sarah would come home for a bit just to talk. He'd said there were things he needed to explain, things she deserved to understand. He'd sounded vulnerable and broken, and I could see Sarah's resolve wavering. She'd looked at me, and I'd nodded. She'd told him she'd come home for a few hours on Saturday before Thanksgiving dinner. She'd said she needed to hear what he had to say. When she'd left the house that Saturday afternoon, I'd felt a chill. I'd wondered if I'd made a mistake letting her go back there alone. I'd wondered if David's desperation might push him to do something more extreme than manipulation. But she'd come back 2 hours later. Her expression hardened. She'd said he'd given her the same promises and explanations he'd given her over the phone. He'd offered solutions that didn't actually solve anything. He'd suggested they talk to a therapist, that they might be able to work through this. But when she'd asked him directly if he'd tried to manipulate me into giving him access to my house, if he'd actually been planning to use my estate for his financial gain, he'd gotten defensive. He'd said he'd never done anything of the sort, that I'd misunderstand. Ooed casual conversation, that I was a controlling old man who couldn't stand the idea of his daughter being happy with someone else. And that's when Sarah had known that everything I'd told her was true. I'd made the decision to tell him at Thanksgiving. I hadn't planned it to be dramatic at first, but then I'd thought about all those comments he'd made about the house, all those pointed observations about my age, about the property value, about what they'd do with it eventually. And I'd decided he deserved to understand publicly that his plan had failed, that he'd miscalculated, that I'd seen what he was doing and I'd protected my daughter from it. He'd been pushing harder as the holidays approached, probably sensing that something was shifting, probably feeling the need to make his move before circumstances changed. He needed to know that his timing was off, that he'd run out of runway. The evening of Thanksgiving, we'd all gathered at the house. my sister Linda and her husband Tom. Sarah, looking fragile but determined, steeling herself for what was coming, David, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse. I'd prepared the turkey, made Ellen's favourite stuffing recipe, set the table with the good dishes. Everything was normal on the surface. Everything was about to break. We'd been eating for maybe 20 minutes, making polite conversation about work and weather and family gossip, when David had started with his comments. He'd seemed relaxed, even pleased with himself. He'd leaned back in his chair and looked around the dining room like he was appraising it. "You know, this place really does have potential," he'd said conversationally, like he was just making an observation. "I've been thinking about it more and more. The bones are good. The location is solid. With the right updates, this could be worth significantly more than what it's worth now." He'd look directly at me and I could see him testing the waters. Right now, in this condition, it's sort of a money pit. But imagine what we could do with it. The way he'd said, "we," like he'd already assumed he'd have some stake in the decision about what happened to it, like he'd already decided that the house belonged to him in some future state. Linda had looked up from her plate, sensing something odd in his tone. Tom had continued eating, not particularly engaged. "I'm serious," he'd continued, his confidence growing because nobody had shut him down yet. He'd actually begun to believe he could get away with this. I mean, those gardens out back are nice and all, but they're taking up space that could be built on. You could add a guest house, or additional parking, or expand the main structure. There's real value being left on the table here. Ellen's garden. The garden she'd designed and planted and tended for decades. The place where Sarah had learned to grow things, where the house's history was literally rooted into the earth, where my wife's hands had shaped the soil and chosen every single plant. "And when you're not around anymore," David had said, looking at me directly now, his smile taking on a particular edge, like he was saying something funny that only I would understand. "We're definitely going to do something with this place. Really maximize what it could be worth." The silence was immediate. Linda set down her fork. Tom stopped eating. Sarah's face had gone pale. "When I'm not around anymore," I'd repeated quietly. "You've thought about that?" "Of course," he'd said, completely oblivious to how he sounded, how predatory his confidence appeared. "I mean, it's going to be Sarah's eventually anyway, right? We might as well have a plan for how to make the best use of it." "The best financial use," I'd said. "Well, yes, I mean, that's what assets are for, to appreciate, to build wealth." I could feel Linda and Tom exchanging looks. I could see Sarah's hands trembling as she held her fork. She knew what was coming. We discussed it beforehand. I'd told her I was going to do this at dinner. I'd told her I wanted David to understand, publicly, that his plan had failed. She'd asked if I was sure, if I was ready to cause this kind of family chaos, and I'd told her yes. I was ready, because some things were worth chaos. The room had gone quiet. I could feel my sister's shock. Her judgment of the comment. I could see Sarah's face closing. Her understanding that he'd just confirmed everything we'd discussed over the past week. He'd just said out loud the thing he'd been dancing around for months. He'd let his mask slip. He'd revealed what this was all about. That's when I'd stood up. That's when I'd reached into my bag and pulled out the folder. "I think it's time everyone knew what's really going on here," I'd said quietly. I'd opened the folder slowly, deliberately, making sure he understood this wasn't an impulse. This was calculated. This was something I'd prepared for. "You see, David, you've made a lot of assumptions about my daughter's future, about what would happen to this house when I'm gone, about how you and Sarah would benefit from my death." His face had gone pale. His hand had started to shake. He'd tried to say something, but nothing had come out. "But here's what you didn't know," I'd continued. I'd pulled out the deed documentation. I'd walked it over to Sarah and handed it to her. "The house isn't in my will. It's not something that's going to pass through any legal system or require any interpretation. It's already transferred. As of last week, this house belongs to Sarah. Solely, exclusively, in her name only." Sarah's hands had been shaking as she'd looked at the paperwork. She'd known this was coming. We'd discussed it. But seeing it in writing, understanding the permanence of it, was different. "What?" David had said, his voice cracking. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about you making a very clear statement about what you'd do with my family's home once I was dead, and me making an equally clear statement about what you're not going to do with it. You're not going to touch it. You're not going to flip it. You're not going to strip it for value. You're not going to use it to solve the financial problems you've created through your own recklessness and dishonesty. I'd looked directly at him across the table, and I'd let him see everything I felt. You tried to manipulate your way into my daughter's inheritance. You tried to position yourself to steal what isn't yours. You made comments about this house like it was a problem to be solved rather than a home to be protected. And you made all of those comments believing I was vulnerable, believing I was old enough to be easily managed, believing that eventually grief or age or weakness would make me compliant with your plans. Listen, David had started, his voice taking on that placating tone. This is just a misunderstanding. This is between you and me, not something we need to... My daughter needed to know what kind of man she married, I'd said, cutting him off. Everyone at this table needed to know, so yes, David, I think this is exactly something we need to discuss. The silence that followed had been complete. Tom had set his fork down. Linda had looked away. Sarah had been studying the deed papers like she still couldn't believe what she was reading. David had turned to Sarah, and I'd watched him try to shift tactics. He'd tried appealing to her, trying to explain that this was all a misunderstanding, that he'd never actually been trying to do anything improper, that her father had just misinterpreted some casual conversations. He'd tried every angle, but Sarah had just shaken her head. I've read the investigation report, she'd said quietly. I know about the foreclosure papers. I know about the casino cash advances. I know about the collection agencies. I know about your debt, and I know what you've been doing. I was trying to provide for us, he'd said desperately. I was trying to build something. You were trying to use my family to dig yourself out of a hole you created, Sarah had replied. You were trying to use my father's house and my father's death to solve problems that are entirely yours. I'd watched him realize in that moment that his play had failed completely, that not only had his plan been thwarted, but it had been exposed. His wife understood now. His wife understood that she'd married someone predatory, someone who'd been using her, someone who'd been willing to manipulate her father's death for financial gain. I think you should leave, I'd said calmly. I think you should go home and think about what you've done, and I think you should prepare yourself for what comes next. He'd stood up, knocking his chair back. He'd opened his mouth like he wanted to say something threatening, something that would restore his sense of control. But he'd looked around the table and seen 4 people looking at him, with various degrees of contempt and disgust, and he'd understood that there was nothing to say, nothing he could do in that moment that would change what had just happened. He'd left. He'd walked to the door and left. We'd heard his car start, heard him spin his tyres on the gravel driveway like he was trying to convey anger through acceleration, and then he was gone. We'd sat in silence for a moment. Then Tom had raised his glass. To looking out for family, he'd said. Everyone had raised their glasses except Sarah, who was still looking at the deed papers like they were a document in a language she was still learning to read. I'd raised mine, and we'd all drunk to it. It wasn't a celebration, not really. It was an acknowledgement, an understanding that sometimes protecting the people you love means making moves they don't expect, taking actions that might strain relationships, doing things that are necessary even when they're difficult. Ellen would have approved. Ellen had always been willing to make the hard call, to do what needed to be done rather than what felt comfortable. She'd raised Sarah to have that same backbone. And now I'd reminded David that I had it too. We sat for a long moment after the door closed behind him. Linda picked up her wine glass with a slightly shaking hand and took a long sip. Tom was staring at his plate like he couldn't quite remember what food was supposed to taste like. Sarah was still holding the deed papers, her fingers trembling slightly as she looked at her own name printed on the legal document. This house. This was hers now. Not a future inheritance, not something conditional, not something that could be negotiated or manipulated or claimed by someone else. It was hers. And everyone at that table had just witnessed the moment her father had made it explicitly clear that she was worth protecting, even if it meant direct confrontation with her husband. Well, Linda said after a few more moments of silence, that was something. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not disapproval exactly, but something complicated, concern maybe, worry about what came next. I assume you knew how that was going to go. I had a pretty good idea, I said. David's not particularly good at hiding what he wants, and he's gotten increasingly careless about it as he's gotten more desperate. He was bound to say something eventually. You could have told us, Tom said, not unkindly. Given us some warning about what was coming. I could have, I agreed, but that would have meant asking you to keep a secret from him, and David would have sensed something was off. He's paranoid enough without giving him actual reasons to be suspicious. I needed him to walk into this room believing he had the upper hand. I needed him to feel comfortable enough to show his cards. Sarah looked up from the deed papers. I still can't believe he's actually gone, she said quietly. I keep waiting for him to come back, like this is all some kind of dramatic pause in an argument. He might, I said, but not tonight. Tonight he's probably sitting in his car somewhere trying to figure out what to do next. Tomorrow he'll start making calls to his lawyer. In a few days he'll probably show up here trying to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding, that I was overreacting, that we can still work this out. That's the pattern with men like David. They escalate, they get confronted, and then they try to negotiate their way back into the situation. Can we? Sarah asked, and the vulnerability in that question broke my heart a little bit. She already knew the answer, but she was still hoping I might tell her something different. No, I said gently. Not from where I'm standing. He tried to position himself to steal this house through your trust and my death. That's not a misunderstanding. That's not a rough patch in a marriage. That's premeditated financial fraud, and it involves using your love against you as a tool. He didn't accidentally ask you to add him to the deed. He didn't casually wonder about property values. He was methodically, deliberately setting up a plan to profit from me not being alive anymore. Linda reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. Your dad's right, honey. Some things you can forgive. This isn't one of them. Not this. Not when it involves hurting the people you love to solve your own problems. We finished dinner quietly after that. The turkey was cold by the time anyone got back to it, and none of us had much appetite anyway. But we went through the motions because that's what you do after a family bomb has detonated. You keep eating. You keep talking. You maintain some semblance of normalcy even though everything has fundamentally shifted. Tom told a story about a project at work that went wrong. Linda talked about her book club and a drama with one of the members. I stood up and cleared plates and brought out dessert like I wasn't still riding the adrenaline of confrontation. My hands were shaking a little, though I tried to hide it. I'd been preparing for this moment mentally for weeks, but the actual execution of it, the watching it unfold in real time, had drained something out of me. Sarah picked at her pie without eating much of anything. She was somewhere else mentally, processing the implications of what had just happened. Her marriage was essentially over now, not because of a moment of decision, but because her father had made a decision for her by revealing something she could no longer unknow. That's a particular kind of weight to carry. Gratitude mixed with anger, mixed with relief, mixed with grief. All of it happening simultaneously inside her chest, and no good way to untangle which emotion was supposed to come first. I could see her mind working through the layers of it. The anger at David for being what he was, the anger at herself for not seeing it sooner, the gratitude that I'd protected her, the sadness that her marriage, whatever she'd hoped it would be, was fundamentally poisoned. After dinner, Linda and Tom excused themselves around 9 o'clock. Linda hugged Sarah for a long time before they left, the kind of hug that's mostly about comfort and not very much about goodbye. She whispered something in Sarah's ear that I couldn't hear, but Sarah nodded and held onto her tighter. Tom shook my hand, and I could see the unasked questions in his face. Questions about whether I'd gone too far, whether there might have been another way, whether this was actually justice or just revenge dressed up in a respectable suit. You did the right thing, he said finally, like he was trying to convince himself as much as reassure me. He would have gone through with it if he'd had the chance. Men like that don't stop until someone stops them. Yeah, I said, I know. After they left, Sarah and I sat by the fireplace in the living room. The fire was burning low, and the evening had grown cold. She was still holding the deed papers. She'd looked at them so many times over the past hour that I wondered if she'd memorized every line of legal language. She kept running her fingers over her signature, like she was checking to make sure it was real, that this wasn't some kind of elaborate hallucination. What happens now? She asked. With David, I mean, legally. What are the steps? Divorce proceedings, I said. You'll need to contact a lawyer. I can recommend someone good, someone who handles situations like this where there's financial fraud involved. You'll be able to show that his attempted manipulation of the property deed, combined with his mounting debts and the evidence of his scheming, gives you grounds for a contested divorce. The house is protected because it's in your name only now. Your other assets might be subject to division, but this place is yours. That's important. That's what matters most right now. How did you even know? She asked. How did you figure all of this out? It's not like he was careless. He was actually pretty subtle about it. I didn't figure it out overnight, I admitted. It started with a feeling. He kept asking about the house in ways that seemed odd, not in the way someone asks because they're interested in home improvement or because they're thinking about the future with their spouse, the way someone asks who's trying to figure out an asset value. How much would this place be worth? How old are the systems? Have you thought about selling? What would the property be worth if we modernised it? On its own, none of those questions would mean anything. But together, in the context of what I learned about his financial situation, they painted a picture. "You hired someone to investigate him," Sarah said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "And you didn't tell me until I really needed to know?" "That's right." She was quiet for a long time. I could see her working through whether that was betrayal or protection, whether I had the right to make that decision on her behalf, whether the outcome justified the means. It was a fair question, and one I'd asked myself many times before I'd made the call to hire the investigator. "I'm glad you did," she finally said. "I hate that you did it, but I'm glad. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," I said. "You're allowed to feel complicated things about this." She looked into the fire. "I keep thinking about how close I was to signing away access to this house. He asked me, last month. He said if we were going to build a future together, maybe I should add him to the deed, make it official, show him I trusted him, and I almost did. But you didn't." "No." Something stopped me. Some little voice in my head said this wasn't right. I thought it was just me being paranoid or controlling or not trusting enough. I almost pushed past it, almost told him yes just to prove I wasn't the problem in our relationship. But it felt wrong. It felt like walking into a trap. "Ellen used to call that the gut feeling," I said. "She said it was more reliable than logic sometimes, because your gut picks up on patterns and inconsistencies that your conscious mind hasn't quite processed yet. Some part of you knew David wasn't who he claimed to be. That's what saved you." Sarah smiled a little at the mention of her mother. "Mum would have handled this differently. Probably would have shot him the moment he walked through the door," I said. Sarah laughed, a real laugh, and it was the first time I'd heard that sound from her in weeks. We sat together in the firelight, and I felt something in my chest settle. I'd made the right call, not the easy call, not the comfortable call, but the right one. Whatever came next, whatever mess would have to be cleaned up, Sarah would get through it. She would survive it, and she'd keep this house, she'd keep her mother's garden, she'd keep the place where her memories lived. The next week was chaos in ways that didn't announce themselves loudly, but were absolutely consuming underneath the surface. Sarah called a lawyer on Monday morning, first thing when her shift ended at the hospital. Her voice on the phone to me was steady but hollow, like she was operating on autopilot while the rest of her was still back at that dinner table trying to process what had happened. I had already given her Richard's contact information, a divorce attorney who specialised in cases involving financial fraud and property disputes. She met with him Tuesday afternoon. By Wednesday morning, David had been served with notice that she was filing for separation. David called repeatedly that week, his tone changing from day to day depending on what strategy he was employing. Remorse on Monday, anger on Tuesday, a kind of desperate pleading on Wednesday. He called from different numbers, probably assuming she'd blocked him on his main line. He left voicemails that ranged from apologetic to threatening to confused. He showed up at the hospital where Sarah worked on Thursday and was immediately escorted off the property by security. The lawyer advised Sarah not to speak to him directly about any of it, and to let all communication go through legal channels. That meant every call would be screened, every message documented, every interaction recorded. It was the right move, but it also meant Sarah was living in a state of heightened awareness, never qui, to sure when he might try to contact her again. I watched my daughter become someone I hadn't quite seen before. She was simultaneously fragile and steel. She went to work and did her nursing shifts like nothing was happening, maintaining her professional composure, checking on patients, managing medications and IVs like the world hadn't just shattered around her. But underneath that professional shell, she was also something harder. She met with divorce attorneys and made copies of all the financial documents and began the slow, tedious process of untangling the shared accounts. She was operating on adrenaline and rage and a kind of cold clarity that comes from understanding you've been lied to by someone you trusted absolutely. David hired a lawyer too, a very expensive one, which raised questions about how he was paying for it given his stated financial troubles. His lawyer was aggressive from the start, sending a cease and desist letter accusing me of interfering in their marriage and creating a hostile environment. The letter suggested that the property transfer to Sarah had been done under duress or under the influence of my manipulation. It was written in that particular brand of legal language designed to sound serious and threatening, even when it had no real substance. Cease and desist letters are mostly performance. They're designed to intimidate and confuse, to make you think you've done something wrong even if you haven't. My lawyer, Richard, responded with characteristic calm. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't get defensive. He laid out the timeline of David's financial troubles with excruciating precision. He referenced the investigation documents. He mentioned that any attempt to claim the property transfer was fraudulent, would require David to open himself up to discovery about his finances and his movements and his communications. The legal implication was crystal clear without being explicitly stated. Take this further, and you're going to expose yourself to things much worse than a property transfer you can't contest. You're going to have to explain how you obtained your attorney's fees. You're going to have to document your income. You're going to have to justify every financial decision you've made. In the past year, David's lawyer went quiet after that. Sarah received the draft divorce papers 2 weeks later, just before Christmas. The split was remarkably clean because David didn't actually have anything worth fighting over. The house was hers, protected by the deed transfer. The cars, she kept one and he got one. The bank accounts were separated based on what each had contributed. His credit card debts were his. His outstanding casino debts were his. She walked away with approximately nothing to his name except the modest savings she'd accumulated herself through years of nursing shifts and careful budgeting, and the salary she was still earning by showing up to work even while her life was imploding. What she did get was freedom. Clean, absolute, no negotiation freedom. No shared property that would keep them tied to each other. No shared debts that would require years of payments. No joint accounts that would need to be managed or negotiated. She was simply and completely free of him. It was remarkable in its finality. She also got to understand something deeper. She understood that her father, even though they'd had complicated moments over the years, had been willing to move mountains to protect her. He'd spent money on an investigator. He'd consulted with lawyers. He'd navigated complex legal processes and kept secrets, and orchestrated a family confrontation that had probably cost him something, emotionally, and definitely cost him something in his relationship with her marriage. He'd done all of that because he loved her more than he worried about being comfortable or being liked or avoiding conflict. Ellen would have done the same thing. Had done similar things over the years when it came to protecting Sarah. Fought with teachers who underestimated her. Managed difficult relationships with family members who didn't understand. Made hard calls about what Sarah needed versus what Sarah wanted. That was the parents' job, and I'd done mine. By the new year, the immediate chaos had settled into a kind of managed discomfort. David was still technically married to Sarah, but essentially removed from any part of her life. He was living in an apartment across town that he probably couldn't afford, given his financial situation. He wasn't returning any of the family's phone calls. He'd stopped his legal fight after Richard's response. The divorce was grinding through the system at its glacial pace, the way the Canadian legal system does, methodical and slow, but ultimately impossible to derail. But Sarah was beginning to breathe again. I could see it in the way she moved through the house, the way the tension in her shoulders was slowly loosening, the way she was starting to think about things other than the immediate crisis. She asked me one afternoon over tea if I regretted it. Not the property transfer, but the public confrontation, the fact that her marriage had ended so dramatically in front of her aunt and uncle that there was no way to hide it or spare anyone's feelings. No, I said. If it had happened quietly, if I'd let you make the choice without full information, you might have spent years trying to make it work. You might have eventually given him money, or added him to the deed, or made compromises that would have slowly eroded your security. This way, it's done. Cleanly. Irrevocably. You can move forward knowing that the choice was made for good reasons, not based on hope that he might change. Do you think he will? She asked. Change, I mean. Do you think any of this was a wake-up call for him? I thought about David's desperation at that dinner table, the way his mask had cracked, the fundamental absence of accountability in his responses. No, I said honestly. I think he'll blame you. Blame me. Blame his circumstances. He'll learn that the house transfer worked the way it worked, but he won't understand why he tried what he tried. That requires a level of self-awareness I don't think he possesses. That's sad, Sarah said. It is, I agreed. But it's not your job to fix it. That's one of the things I needed you to understand. His problems are his debts, his decisions, his failures. Those don't belong to you. They never did. He just tried very hard to convince you that they did." She nodded slowly, absorbing that. Outside, winter was deepening. The garden was sleeping under snow, dormant and waiting for spring. The house stood around us, solid and real, and hers in a way that nothing could change. Now I thought about Ellen, about what she would have said about all of this. She would have been proud, I think. Proud that her daughter had the strength to walk away. Proud that her husband had loved them enough to make the hard call. Proud that family meant something worth fighting for. Looking back now, months later, I can see all the pieces of what happened with clarity I didn't have in the moment. David was a man drowning in his own failures, and instead of learning to swim, he looked for someone else to pull under with him. He chose his wife, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of a fundamental belief that what he wanted should matter more than what was true. He believed his need for money was more important than Sarah's security. He believed his financial problems justified manipulating someone who loved him. He believed that consequences were something that happened to other people, not to him. I chose differently. I chose to tell the truth, even though it was complicated and painful. I chose to protect my daughter, even though it meant making decisions she wasn't quite ready to make herself. I chose to use the power I had as a parent, as someone with resources and legal knowledge and a lifetime of experience navigating complex situations, to ensure that my daughter wouldn't spend years paying for her husband's mistakes. The deed transfer did what I meant for it to do. It protected the house. It protected Sarah. It made absolutely clear to David that his plan had failed. But it did something else too. It reminded my daughter that she was worth protecting. That she was loved not conditionally or partially, but absolutely and completely. That there were people in her life who would fight for her without hesitation or negotiation. That's the thing about revenge that isn't actually revenge. It doesn't feel like victory when you're doing it. It feels like duty. It feels like necessity. But it also feels, ultimately, like love. It's the most tangible expression of it. Not the easy kind of love that just affirms what the other person wants. The hard kind. The kind that says no to what you want in order to protect what you need. The kind that is willing to damage a relationship if it means keeping someone safe. David tried to teach me a lesson about being expendable, about being old and in the way. He tried to position my death as a solution to his problems, but instead I taught him a lesson about consequences, about the fact that predatory behavior has limits, about the fact that there are still people in this world who will stand against it, who will spend resources and time and emotional capital to stop it. People who understand that sometimes you have to burn a bridge to keep someone from crossing it. That house is still standing. Sarah still lives in it. She's rebuilt parts of her life and is carefully, cautiously exploring who she wants to be as a woman, not as a wife, not as the person trying to solve David's problems. She's in therapy, working through the betrayal and the guilt, working to understand how she missed the warning signs and how to trust herself again. She's slowly healing. She's learning to trust her instincts again, the same instincts that told her something was wrong even before I had the evidence to prove it. The garden is coming back to life as spring approaches. Sarah has been spending time out there, tending to things, planting new flowers in places where Ellen's choices have faded. She's making the space her own now, not just maintaining what Ellen built, but creating something that reflects who Sarah is becoming. That feels important, that feels like moving forward. And me? I'm living with the knowledge that I made a difficult decision and it was the right one. Not the kind of right that feels good all the time, the kind of right that sits with you and says, you did what was necessary. You protected who needed protecting. You made the hard call when the easy call would have been to look away. Ellen would have approved. Ellen would have understood that sometimes love looks like drawing a line and refusing to let someone cross it. Sometimes love looks like saying no. Sometimes it looks like standing your ground and making someone else understand that you are not a victim, and neither is your daughter, and neither of you will ever be. I think about that moment at Thanksgiving, when I handed Sarah the deed. I think about David's face when he realized his plan had failed completely. I think about the silence that followed, the weight of understanding that he'd tried to steal and been caught. And I realized that what I did wasn't about revenge. Revenge would have required me to want him to suffer. It would have required me to derive satisfaction from his pain. What I did was about protection. It was about drawing a boundary and making it absolutely clear that there were limits to what would be tolerated in this family. It was about telling my daughter that she mattered more than comfort or convenience, or avoiding confrontation. It was about demonstrating that sometimes the hard thing and the right thing are the same thing. David's still out there somewhere. I don't know where, and I don't particularly care. The divorce is still grinding through the system, but it's inevitable now Sarah will be free. The house will remain hers, and David will learn that consequences are real, and that you can't con your way through life by manipulating the people who love you. That's enough. That's more than enough. That's justice.